Step into the hidden world of medieval brothels, a place of flickering candlelight, whispered secrets, and lives lived on the edge. These houses were more than dens of pleasure. They were workplaces, survival arenas, and stages where women navigated danger, disease, and exploitation every day. Today, we'll uncover the harsh realities behind the myths, the streets, the laws, the neighborhoods shaped by vice, and the women whose resilience allowed them to endure. Prepare to see the shocking truth of medieval life, far beyond fantasy, and witness the human cost behind the doors of these infamous establishments. The origins of medieval brothels. To understand the shocking reality of medieval brothels, we first need to look back at how they came into existence and why, despite centuries of moral condemnation, they were allowed to flourish. Prostitution is as old as recorded history. The Romans had brothels lining their cities, openly regulated and taxed by the empire. When Rome collapsed, the infrastructure of these houses vanished, but the practice itself never disappeared. As Europe transitioned into the Middle Ages, prostitution adapted to new environments. By the 12th century, with towns and cities growing again, brothels re-emerged not as secret dens of lust, but as publicly acknowledged, and often officially tolerated, institutions. The medieval church condemned prostitution as sinful, yet theologians wrestled with how to handle it. St. Augustine had argued centuries earlier that prostitution was a necessary evil. His reasoning was blunt. If prostitutes vanished, lust would run rampant, and respectable wives and daughters would be in greater danger. This uneasy compromise condemning the practice, while admitting its supposed utility, became the foundation of medieval policy toward brothels. City officials embraced this contradiction. Urban centres like Paris, London, and Avignon understood that prostitution wasn't going away. Men, whether students, soldiers, or merchants, would seek it out, regardless of the law. So rather than drive the trade underground, towns sought to contain it. Brothels were licensed, sometimes built in specific districts, and frequently taxed. By concentrating them in certain neighborhoods, authorities claimed they were protecting respectable citizens from vice while filling their coffers with steady revenue. Take London as an example. Across the River Thames in Southwark lay the infamous stews. These bathhouse brothels were openly sanctioned by the Bishop of Winchester. Prostitutes working there were called Winchester geese, a mocking term that reflected both their trade and their vulnerability. The women paid rent and taxes, while officials profited handsomely from the business they claimed to despise. Similar systems existed in many European cities, blurring the line between public morality and private profit. But the origins of brothels weren't purely economic. They were also a way of controlling women's bodies. Authorities feared loose women wandering the streets, believing them to be a threat to public order. By forcing them into designated houses, under regulation, men in power could monitor them, restrict their movements, and keep them marked as outcasts. Brothels became cages visible, sanctioned places of exclusion where women could be watched and controlled. Interestingly, not all brothels were run by unscrupulous pimps or shadowy figures. Some were municipal institutions, officially owned by towns. In a strange twist of history, there were cases where local governments literally acted as brothel keepers, employing madams, setting prices, and collecting the profits. In other words, the very same authorities who outlawed adultery and railed against fornication were, in some instances, the landlords of prostitution. The paradox ran deeper when the church became involved. While priests thundered sermons against lust, monasteries sometimes rented properties to brothel owners, profiting indirectly. In Avignon, during the papal residency of the 14th century, the sex trade boomed. Pilgrims, clerics, and merchants flocked to the city, and the brothels thrived under a thin veil of official tolerance. The irony was hard to miss. The heart of Christian Europe was simultaneously a thriving hub of commercial sex. Brothels also spread because of war and migration. Soldiers, mercenaries, and travelers created constant demand. In garrison towns, women followed armies, sometimes willingly, sometimes forced, and brothels grew up to service soldiers. These establishments became both a source of entertainment and a safety valve, at least in the eyes of commanders who believed controlled prostitution reduced desertion, rape, and unrest among their men. Yet despite this tolerance, brothels always carried stigma. Prostitutes were branded as sinful, corrupt, and unworthy of respect. They might be necessary, but they were never accepted. This social hypocrisy, needing their services, but despising their presence, defined the origins of medieval brothels. The women inside bore the full weight of this contradiction, tolerated for their use, hated for their existence. By the 13th and 14th centuries, almost every major European city had its brothel district. They were often located near rivers, on the outskirts of towns, or next to universities where young men congregated. The authorities' message was clear: prostitution belonged, but only within controlled, visible boundaries. As cities expanded, so too did these districts, growing into entrenched parts of urban life. The origins of medieval brothels reveal the foundation of everything that followed. A world where morality and necessity collided, where women's suffering was institutionalized, and where exploitation was cloaked in the language of order and control. They were not born out of liberation or pleasure, but out of fear, hypocrisy, and the need to regulate human desire. This uneasy beginning set the stage for centuries of contradiction. On the one hand, brothels provided income, entertainment, and supposed protection for society. On the other, they became cages of exploitation, where the poorest and most vulnerable women were trapped. And as we move forward in this story, we'll see how these contradictions played out through the owners who profited, the women who endured, and the societies that tried to balance piety with pragmatism. Who owned the brothels? When we picture a medieval brothel, it's easy to imagine a shady underworld figure running the show, a cunning madam or a ruthless pimp, squeezing every coin out of desperate women. And while that image wasn't entirely wrong, the reality of ownership was often far stranger and far more hypocritical than most people realize. Because in many medieval cities, brothels weren't just private businesses. They were investments. They were sources of reliable income. And in some cases, they were openly owned, regulated, or profited from by the very same authorities who condemned prostitution as sinful. Take London, for example. Across the Thames in Southwark, the infamous stews were not secret dens at all, but public, regulated bathhouse brothels. And who owned them? The Bishop of Winchester. Yes, a high-ranking churchman, supposedly devoted to chastity and moral order, oversaw one of England's most notorious red-light districts. The prostitutes who worked there were nicknamed Winchester geese, a cruel, mocking label that stripped them of humanity while reminding everyone who collected their rent. The church itself, this was not an isolated case. In many cities, local governments owned or leased brothel properties. Officials realized that prostitution wasn't going away, so they transformed it into a steady revenue stream. By placing brothels under municipal ownership or by taxing them heavily, they ensured the profits went into city coffers. It was a cynical but practical calculation. If vice was inevitable, then at least the community could benefit financially. Of course, brothels were also privately owned, often run by women. Madams, sometimes called abbesses of the house, with bitter irony, were common figures in the trade. They acted as landlords, employers, and enforcers. A madam rented rooms, set prices, and often controlled every aspect of the women's lives. On the surface, some of these women appeared powerful, respected even, but beneath that facade was a world built on exploitation. The prostitutes rarely kept their earnings. Most of their money went to cover rent, food, clothing, and bribes. Debt was a trap, and many women found themselves unable to leave the brothel, no matter how hard they worked. In some cases, wealthy merchants or landlords also dabbled in brothel ownership. For them, it was simply another business investment, no different from owning a tavern or a mill. They might never set foot inside the brothel themselves, but they happily collected the profits. These investors often enjoyed protection from city officials, who preferred having respectable citizens running the establishments rather than uncontrolled criminals. But while cities and investors saw profit, the women inside saw little more than bondage. Brothel ownership was rarely about providing safety or stability. Instead, it was about control. By keeping prostitution confined to specific houses, under specific ownership, authorities ensured that the women were easy to monitor, easy to tax, and easy to punish. The system wasn't built to protect them, it was built to exploit them. And then there was the darker side of ownership, criminal gangs. In some towns, especially port cities, brothels were controlled by thugs who used violence to maintain order. These brothels weren't just about sex, they were hubs of gambling, smuggling, and extortion. Women became pawns in a larger criminal economy, caught between abusive pimps, corrupt officials, and desperate clients. What makes the question of ownership so shocking isn't just who ran the brothels, but how openly society accepted their role. City councils debated regulations in public meetings. Bishops drew income from rents without shame. Wealthy families quietly held stakes in properties used for prostitution. Everyone denounced sin in words, but many happily lived off the profits of vice. This hypocrisy shaped the daily reality of brothels. The women inside weren't just battling hunger, disease, and stigma. They were trapped in a system designed from the top down to exploit them. They weren't only the victims of cruel pimps or violent customers, but of landlords, city councils, and even bishops who profited from their suffering. And this is one of the most important truths about medieval brothels. They were never purely underground, never entirely criminal. They were part of the social and economic system, embedded in the very fabric of medieval towns. To understand who owned the brothels is to understand how society itself was complicit. The hypocrisy ran so deep that people could sit in church on Sunday, listening to fiery sermons against lust, then walk past the bishop's brothel on Monday, knowing full well where the money collected at the door was going. And no one spoke of it openly. It was an unspoken agreement: condemn in public, profit in private. Ownership of brothels reveals a dark paradox. These houses were tolerated because they made money, controlled unruly women, and provided an outlet for male desire. But that tolerance came at the cost of institutionalizing exploitation. The women inside were doubly trapped, enslaved not only by their poverty and their madams, but by the very structures of church and state that claim to uphold morality. As we move forward, we'll look closer at the women themselves. Who were they? How did they end up inside these houses? And what did their lives look like once the brothel door closed behind them? The women who worked there. Step inside the heavy wooden doors of a medieval brothel, and you'll find the women who bore the brunt of its existence. They were the backbone of the business, the reason customers came and coins clinked in landlords' purses. But who were these women? How did they end up here? And what did their lives truly look like once they crossed the threshold? The harsh truth is this: very few women chose this path willingly. Romantic images of courtesans draped in silks, entertaining noblemen with wit and charm, belonged more to Renaissance courts or later novels than to the raw reality of medieval Europe. The average prostitute was not a glamorous figure. She was poor, she was desperate, and she was often trapped. Many were orphans, abandoned by parents who had died of plague, famine, or war. With no family to protect them and no dowry to secure marriage, these girls became easy prey for brothel keepers. Some were widows, their husbands cut down in battle or taken by disease, leaving them penniless in societies where women had few legal rights to property or inheritance. Others were simply poor daughters of peasants, driven into towns in search of work, only to find that domestic service paid barely enough to survive. The line between choice and coercion was often blurred. Some women were lured in with promises of steady food and lodging, only to discover that they had signed themselves into debt bondage. Brothel owners or madams would supply clothes, a bed, and meals, but these came at a cost. Every item was tallied, every drink added to the bill, until the woman found herself owing more than she earned. Escape became nearly impossible. For others, the path was more brutal. Some were sold into prostitution by their families, especially in times of famine, when one less mouth to feed could mean survival. Criminal gangs trafficked women from one city to another, moving them like goods along trade routes. In the darker corners of history, the brothel was less a workplace and more a prison. And what was life like once inside? Miserable, more often than not. The women lived in cramped, dirty rooms, often sharing beds or sleeping on straw. Privacy was almost non-existent. Customers barged in at all hours, drunk and loud. Violence was a constant threat. Beatings and assaults were considered part of the trade. If a woman resisted, she risked punishment from both her customer and the brothel's enforcers. Disease haunted every breath. Long before doctors understood infection, prostitutes bore the brunt of sexually transmitted diseases. Some of these were old gonorrhea, and other infections spread quickly in unsanitary conditions. Later, in the late Middle Ages, syphilis swept through Europe like wildfire, leaving scars, madness, and death in its wake. Women grew sick, their bodies breaking down, yet they were expected to keep working until they collapsed. Few lived long lives. Social stigma compounded their suffering. Prostitutes were forced to wear distinctive clothing, striped hoods, yellow scarves, bells on their dresses, public marks of shame that set them apart from respectable women. This branding stripped them of dignity and made them targets of ridicule. Children threw stones, priests spat curses, and townsfolk mocked them openly, even as the same men visited them under cover of night. Yet despite the stigma, demand never ceased. Customers came from all walks of life, soldiers passing through, students from universities, travelling merchants, even nobles and clergy. The hypocrisy was staggering. Men could indulge freely, their reputations largely untouched, while women were forever marked as fallen. Some prostitutes attempted to form communities within brothels, finding friendship and solidarity with one another. Together they shared food, traded gossip, and looked out for each other against violent men. A few madams were former prostitutes themselves, and though many were exploitative, some tried to shield their women from the worst abuses. But these small acts of kindness could not erase the crushing reality of life inside. For the women, the brothel was not a house of pleasure, but a place of survival. Each day was about enduring, earning just enough to eat, avoiding the worst violence, and clinging to whatever scraps of dignity remained. Very few escaped this life. Those who did were often barred from marriage, their reputations ruined beyond repair. Some sought refuge in convents, throwing themselves into religious penitence, while others vanished into new towns under new names. But for the majority, the brothel was a life sentence. What makes their story so tragic is not only the suffering they endured, but the way society justified it. Authorities called prostitution a necessary evil, a safety valve to protect good women. Yet it was the prostitutes themselves who paid the price, their bodies and souls consumed by a system designed to exploit them while absolving their customers of guilt. The women of medieval brothels were not nameless shadows. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, human beings caught in the crushing gears of poverty, hypocrisy, and lust. Their voices were rarely recorded, their names often forgotten. But by piecing together the fragments of their lives, we glimpse the cruel reality hidden behind the church bells and castle walls. As we move into the next chapter, we'll step deeper inside these houses and see what life was like within their walls. Beyond the women themselves, what atmosphere did these places hold? What did they look like, smell like, feel like? To understand the shocking reality of medieval brothels, we must walk through the door and look around. Inside the walls of a brothel, close your eyes and step with me across the threshold of a medieval brothel. The wooden door creaks on its hinges, and the smell hits you first. It is an overpowering mixture: stale ale, sweat, smoke from cheap tallow candles, and the unmistakable reek of unwashed bodies. This was not the perfumed boudoir of later romantic novels. It was a cramped, noisy, chaotic world, where the illusion of pleasure barely disguised the stench of survival. Inside, the air is thick, almost suffocating. Light flickers from rush lamps and candles, casting long shadows across low ceilings stained black with soot. The floors are strewn with straw, meant to soak up spilled drink and worse things besides, but it is rarely changed. Underfoot, it crunches, sticky with old ale and filth. Rats scurry along the edges of the room, bold enough to dart out when scraps fall. Brothels in medieval towns were often indistinguishable from taverns. In fact, many were taverns, serving cheap, watered-down wine and beer to draw in customers. Drinking was as much a part of the business as the sex. Tables filled with dice and playing cards clattered with laughter and curses. A lute strummed in one corner, barely audible above the shouts of drunken men. In another, two soldiers argued, fists clenched, ready to erupt into violence. The women moved through it all like shadows. Some wore brightly coloured scarves or striped garments, the mandatory clothing that marked them as prostitutes, branded by law. They leaned against doorframes, forced smiles painted across tired faces, calling out to potential clients with practiced voices. Others sat quietly at the edge of the room, eyes distant, waiting for the inevitable moment when they'd be chosen. For the customers, the brothel was a place of indulgence. For the women, it was work. And the rooms where that work happened were far from the fantasy many imagined. Upstairs, the chambers were small and bare. A thin mattress of straw, sometimes with a sheet if the madam could afford it, lay in the corner. The walls were unplastered, rough timber or cold stone, often damp with moisture. Privacy was scarce. Thin wooden partitions separated one room from another, but the sounds carried gasps, laughter, arguments, echoing through the building. Some brothels disguised themselves as bathhouses, offering warm water to lure men in. These stews, as they were called in London, were dimly lit rooms with large communal tubs. Men would drink, sing, and bathe, while women slipped into the water beside them. But the baths were rarely clean. The water turned cloudy with dirt, oil, and disease, becoming less a luxury and more a breeding ground for infection. The atmosphere inside was not only physical, but emotional. Fear hung heavy in the air. The women knew that at any moment a customer could turn violent, and there was little they could do. Few brothels offered protection, and even fewer allowed the women to refuse a client. Behind every forced smile lay a tension, a readiness to endure whatever came next. But alongside fear, there was noise constant, unrelenting noise. Dice rattled, tankards clinked, men bellowed drinking songs, women laughed too loudly, masking nerves with practiced cheer. It was chaos contained within four walls. For the customers, this cacophony was part of the entertainment. For the women, it was exhaustion. Night after night, the cycle repeated until voices grew hoarse and bodies gave out. Criminal activity thrived in these environments. Pickpockets worked the crowd, slipping coins from drunken patrons. Fights broke out, ending with knives drawn and blood spilled on the straw floor. The madam, if she was wise, kept a hired brute on hand to throw out troublemakers, though sometimes these protectors were as cruel to the women as the customers were. Every sense was assaulted inside a brothel. The taste of sour ale clung to the tongue, the sting of smoke burned the eyes, the press of bodies made the air stifling. It was not pleasure, it was distraction, indulgence, and escape for the men who came through the doors. For the women, it was survival inside a cage that stank of despair. And yet, despite the misery, there was also routine. The women laughed with one another between customers, sang bawdy songs, or gossiped about the men who stumbled in. These small acts of humanity softened the edges of their reality. But they were fleeting moments in an otherwise harsh existence. To step inside a medieval brothel was to step into a paradox, a place where men sought joy and women endured misery, where laughter masks suffering, and where society's greatest hypocrisies came to life in the flicker of candlelight. In the next chapter, we'll look at the rules and regulations that governed these houses, because as chaotic as they seemed, medieval authorities kept brothels under strict control, dictating where women could live, what they could wear, and even how they could behave. Rules and regulations. At first glance, a medieval brothel might seem like a place of chaos, laughter, drunkenness, and unchecked vice spilling through its doors. But look closer, and you'll see that these houses operated under a web of strict rules, laid down by city authorities and enforced with surprising efficiency. The chaos inside was carefully contained by a system designed not to protect the women, but to control them. From London to Paris to Florence, municipal governments created ordinances governing every aspect of brothel life. These laws spelled out where prostitutes could live, what they could wear, when they could appear in public, and even what prices they could charge. On paper, the goal was order, to confine prostitution to specific zones and prevent it from disrupting respectable society. In reality, these rules were cages, ensuring that women could never escape the stigma or the control of their keepers. One of the most common regulations concerned location. Brothels were not allowed near churches, schools, or busy marketplaces. Instead, they were pushed to the margins of towns, often by rivers, on the edge of walls, or in districts officially marked for vice. London's Southwark district, for example, became infamous as a zone of tolerated sin, while in Paris, the Rue de Glatigny served a similar role. Authorities believed that by corralling prostitution into certain neighbourhoods, they could both contain its spread and profit from it more easily. Another striking set of rules revolved around clothing. Prostitutes were forced to wear distinctive garments that marked them as fallen women. In some cities, this meant striped hoods. In others, yellow scarves or veils. Some towns even required bells sewn into their clothing so they could be heard as they walked. The purpose was humiliation. By branding women in this way, authorities ensured they were never mistaken for respectable wives or daughters. It also reinforced their exclusion, making it nearly impossible for them to reintegrate into society. There were also laws about movement. Prostitutes were forbidden to appear in certain areas of town, and many cities banned them from walking the streets during daylight hours. They were allowed out only after dark, reinforcing the idea that they belonged to the night, hidden from the eyes of children and the devout. Breaking these rules could result in harsh punishments, fines, public beatings, or being paraded through town as an example. Inside the brothels, regulations extended to pricing and practice. Authorities sometimes set fixed rates for services, ensuring that customers would not be cheated and, more importantly, that taxes could be calculated accurately. Brothel keepers were often required to keep registers of clients, payments, and even the names of the women working there. In this way, prostitution was treated less as a crime and more as a taxable service industry. But while authorities created these rules under the guise of maintaining order, their true purpose was to maintain control. Women in brothels lived under constant surveillance. They paid fines for minor infractions, fees for licenses, and bribes to avoid harsher punishments. Their existence was tolerated only so long as they obeyed the regulations and continued to generate income for the city. The hypocrisy of these laws is glaring. Men who visited brothels faced few restrictions. They did not wear special clothing. They did not risk public humiliation. They were rarely punished for visiting prostitutes, even though the act itself was technically sinful. The entire burden of regulation fell on the women, branding them as outcasts, while excusing their male clients from scrutiny. Some towns even codified punishments for escape attempts. If a woman tried to leave a brothel without paying her debts, she could be dragged before the courts and forced back into service. In certain cases, women were forbidden from marrying respectable men unless they underwent years of penance, often locked away in a convent. The rules made it clear: once branded a prostitute, society offered little chance of redemption. And yet, despite the restrictions, brothels thrived. Customers accepted the rules as part of the business, while city officials enjoyed the steady flow of revenue. The women, meanwhile, navigated the regulations like prisoners navigating the walls of their cell, forced to live within boundaries they had no power to change. Rules and regulations gave brothels a veneer of order, but beneath it lay cruelty. They were not about morality or safety. They were about profit, control, and humiliation. Every striped hood, every forbidden street, every forced curfew reminded women that they were outcasts, tolerated only because they filled a role society demanded, but refused to acknowledge with dignity. As we move forward, we'll look more closely at these marks of shame, the clothing, the symbols, and the humiliations that branded women in the eyes of their communities. Because for the women inside medieval brothels, stigma wasn't just an idea, it was stitched into the very fabric they were forced to wear. Clothing and mark of shame. If the rules and regulations kept prostitutes confined, it was their clothing that exposed them. A woman could not walk through the streets of a medieval city without the world knowing exactly who she was. The fabric on her back marked her as a prostitute, shaming her in public, branding her as fallen, and ensuring that society never forgot her place. Cities across Europe developed distinctive dress codes for prostitutes. These laws dictated not only what women wore, but also how they were seen and humiliated by everyone else. In Florence, prostitutes were forced to wear striped cloaks. In Venice, they donned yellow scarves or kerchiefs. In parts of France and the German states, they were made to wear bells on their clothing, jingling with every step, announcing their presence like livestock. Yellow was the most common mark. For centuries, yellow had been associated with shame and treachery. Judas was painted in yellow robes in church murals. Jews, too, were often forced to wear yellow badges in the Middle Ages. To drape prostitutes in the same colour was no accident. It told the public, here walks a woman of sin, one who has betrayed the sanctity of marriage and the moral order. Imagine being a woman in such clothing. You step into the marketplace to buy bread, the scarf bright around your shoulders, the stripes loud against the dull browns and greys of peasant clothing. Everyone sees you. Mothers pull their children aside. Men smirk knowingly. Others spit, jeer, or throw stones. The humiliation was constant, inescapable, and deliberately designed to keep women in their place. The clothing also served another purpose: segregation. Authorities wanted to make sure prostitutes could never be mistaken for respectable wives or daughters. In societies obsessed with female chastity, reputation meant everything. A simple garment could destroy a woman's chances of ever reintegrating into society. Even if she left the brothel, the memory of her striped hood or yellow veil would follow her. She was branded for life. But humiliation wasn't confined to fabric. Sometimes prostitutes were forced into theatrical punishments that amplified their shame. In certain towns, if a woman was caught walking without her distinctive clothing, she could be paraded through the streets in nothing but her undergarments, a mock crown on her head, while crowds jeered. Others were made to stand at church doors on Sundays, their garments marking them as sinners, to be gawked at by the very community that profited from their labour. These marks of shame reveal much about medieval society's hypocrisy. Men could visit brothels freely, slipping away with their reputations intact. But the women carried the weight of society's disgust on their shoulders, literally stitched into their clothing. The shame was gendered, one-sided, and cruel. And yet, within these humiliations, there were stories of quiet defiance. Some women embroidered their yellow scarves with patterns, turning them into symbols of individuality rather than just stigma. Others wore their striped cloaks with an almost mocking pride, daring anyone to speak against them. A few even played with the laws, slipping into disguises to mingle in public undetected, risking severe punishment for a taste of anonymity. But these acts of rebellion were rare. For most, the clothing was an iron cage of identity. It stripped them of dignity and ensured they could never escape the gaze of society. Even within the brothel walls, the garments reminded them of who they were in the eyes of the world. Not daughters, not wives, not women with dreams or futures, but prostitutes marked, segregated, and shamed. The use of clothing as a tool of control wasn't unique to prostitutes. Medieval society loved visible markers of status. Nobility wore rich furs and silks. Merchants displayed wealth with fine colours. Peasants wore drab wool, reflecting their station. Prostitutes were simply placed at the very bottom of this hierarchy, their garments designed not to elevate, but to degrade. By forcing prostitutes into uniforms of shame, authorities didn't just separate them from respectable women, they erased their individuality. Each striped cloak or yellow scarf turned a woman into a symbol, a walking warning of sin. Society reduced her to her role, denying her humanity. The marks of shame ensured that even outside the brothel, prostitutes remained confined. They could not walk through the city unseen. They could not hope to blend back into ordinary life. The clothing clung to them like a curse, long after they left the trade. As we move into the next chapter, we'll shift focus to the other side of the brothel door, the men who came seeking its services. Because while women were branded and shamed, men of every rank passed through brothel doors, from ragged soldiers to respected nobles. And their presence tells us even more about the contradictions that kept brothels alive. The customers, to understand the world of medieval brothels, we must step into the shoes of those who kept the doors swinging open. The customers. These establishments didn't thrive because of the women inside them. Alone they thrived because men of every age, rank, and station eagerly sought their services. From ragged mercenaries to pious clerics, from poor apprentices to wealthy nobles, the brothel clientele was as diverse as the medieval world itself. Let's begin with the most obvious group: soldiers and mercenaries. Wars were constant in the Middle Ages, and wherever armies marched, brothels sprang up to follow. Soldiers lived hard lives, months of marching, hunger, bloodshed, and boredom. When they reached a city, they poured into taverns and brothels, drinking away their wages and seeking comfort in the flesh. For them, brothels were as much a release valve as they were a ritual, a way of reclaiming a piece of humanity in between bouts of brutality. Then there were the craftsmen and apprentices. Young men flocked to towns to learn trades, living in crowded guild houses or with masters who worked them to the bone. They had little money, but enough for cheap ale and the occasional visit to a brothel. For apprentices in particular, brothels were often their first introduction to sex. In some cities, it was even tolerated, encouraged, in fact, as a way of keeping young men from dishonoring respectable women. Authorities quietly justified prostitution as a necessary evil, arguing that it kept the social order intact. But perhaps the most surprising group of customers were clerics, priests, monks, and members of the church. Despite vows of chastity, many clergymen frequented brothels. Records from cities like Avignon and Paris list priests among the most regular patrons. The hypocrisy was staggering. These same men preached against sin on Sunday, then paid their way into a brothel on Monday night. Church councils frequently condemned the practice, but the reality was clear. The church was just as entangled in the world of prostitution as the secular authorities. Of course, nobles and wealthy merchants also slipped through the doors. For them, brothels were less about necessity and more about indulgence. They could afford finer establishments, sometimes disguised as bathhouses or private houses, where the wine flowed more freely and the women were dressed in silks rather than rags. Nobles treated brothels as playgrounds, flaunting their wealth, sometimes renting out entire establishments for private debauchery. The hypocrisy was even sharper here, as these same men sat on city councils, writing laws that humiliated the women they visited in secret. Not all customers came for sex. For many men, the brothel was a social hub. It was where drinking, gambling, and camaraderie thrived. Dice clattered across tables, songs echoed off walls, and drunken men bonded over shared indulgence. Some came for the atmosphere, the chaos, the chance to be free from the strict rules of their households or guilds. The brothel was one of the few places where social lines blurred. A nobleman and a beggar could drink from the same jug so long as they had coins in hand. Yet, the reasons men came were not always so light-hearted. For some, it was about loneliness. Medieval life was brutal and short. Death was a constant companion, plague, famine, war. Marriage was often a financial arrangement rather than a union of affection. For many men, the brothel offered a fleeting sense of intimacy, however shallow. It was not love, but it was touching. It was not companionship, but it was the illusion of it, purchased for a few coins. But there was also darkness in the way some customers approached the brothel. Stripped of rules, emboldened by drink, men often acted violently. Women inside had little power to refuse or resist. A customer could be tender one moment and brutal the next, and there was rarely anyone to stop him. The lack of consequences for men meant the risk of abuse was ever present, turning the brothel into a place of danger as much as commerce. What ties all these groups together? Soldiers, apprentices, clerics, merchants, nobles, is the hypocrisy of medieval society. These men were allowed to indulge in the brothel without lasting stigma. Their reputations remained intact, their sins washed away with confession or ignored altogether. Meanwhile, the women they visited were branded, shamed, and forever excluded from respectability. The imbalance was striking, and it reveals the deeper truth. Brothels existed not just because men wanted them, but because society protected men's desires while punishing women's survival. Step back and picture a medieval brothel at night. The doors creak open and close, the crowd inside shifting with each new arrival. A soldier still smelling of the battlefield slumps at a table. A priest in plain robes slips in quietly, hoping no one notices. A young apprentice, nervous and red-faced, clutches a few coins in his hand. And in the corner, a wealthy merchant boasts loudly, tossing silver on the table to impress the room. They are different men from different worlds, but inside the brothel they are united by desire and by the knowledge that, unlike the women serving them, they can leave their shame at the door. In the next chapter, we'll follow the money, because behind the curtains of medieval brothels was another figure, the madam, the keeper of the house who pulled the strings, collected the coins, and decided the fate of the women within. The role of the madam, behind every medieval brothel, was a figure who both commanded authority and carried the weight of suspicion, the madam. She was the keeper of the house, the one who oversaw the women, collected the money, kept the authorities satisfied, and ensured the business stayed afloat. Without her, the brothel could not function. Yet her role was a paradox both powerful and precarious, respected by some, despised by many. Unlike the prostitutes she managed, the madam often wielded a degree of control. She was the one who negotiated with city officials, paid the taxes, and ensured that the establishment abided by the laws regulating clothing, hours, and clientele. In some towns, brothels were licensed directly by the municipality, which meant the madam had to maintain a relationship with the authorities. She was the face of the business, the one blamed if rules were broken or fees unpaid. But her power came at a price. She had to balance loyalty to the women with loyalty to the men who paid for them. Many madams were former prostitutes themselves, women who had aged out of the trade or saved enough money to buy a position of control. This gave them insight into the hardships their girls endured, but it also meant they knew how to squeeze every last coin from them. In this sense, the madams stood at the uncomfortable intersection of solidarity and exploitation. Inside the brothel, the madam ruled with a sharp eye and a sharper tongue. She assigned rooms, set prices, and kept track of debts. Every woman owed her not just a portion of her earnings, but often the cost of food, clothing, and rent as well. The system trapped many women in cycles of debt, ensuring they could never truly escape. To the madam, they were workers, but also investments assets to be managed, punished, or discarded if they ceased to be profitable. Still, the madam's authority was not absolute. She lived in a world where men held ultimate power, and she had to tread carefully to keep the business safe. Drunken soldiers who grew violent, clerics who feared exposure, nobles who demanded special treatment, she had to handle them all. Sometimes that meant smoothing over conflicts with charm. Other times it meant employing hired muscle to enforce order. A successful madam was part negotiator, part accountant, part diplomat, and part enforcer. The relationship between madams and city officials was particularly complex. On one hand, authorities relied on them. Licensed brothels were a steady source of income, and the madam was the one who ensured those taxes were paid. On the other hand, officials were quick to scapegoat madams when moral panic swept through towns. During outbreaks of plague or religious fervor, madams could suddenly find themselves accused of spreading disease or corrupting men, their houses raided or burned, their livelihoods destroyed overnight. Socially, madams occupied a liminal space. They were wealthier than the women they managed, sometimes living in relative comfort compared to the straw mattresses upstairs. They could wear finer clothes, eat better food, and even wield influence within their neighborhoods. Yet they were never fully accepted by respectable society. A madam might hold power within her brothel, but beyond its walls, she remained stigmatized as a peddler of sin. The stories of individual madams reveal both cunning and survival. In London, the infamous brothels of Southwark were run by women known as abbesses, a mocking title likening them to nuns. These abbesses wielded considerable authority, protecting their establishments through bribes to local sheriffs and wardens. In Paris, records describe women like Jeanne de Bruyères, who rose from prostitution to managing an entire network of houses. Their ability to thrive in such a hostile world speaks to their resilience, but also to the brutal choices they made at the expense of the women under them. For the women inside the brothel, the madam was both protector and oppressor. She kept violent men in check sometimes. She ensured food was available and debts could be tallied. But she also punished disobedience harshly, enforcing the very rules that stripped women of autonomy. Many prostitutes feared their madams as much as they feared their clients. The walls of the brothel might have kept out the dangers of the street, but inside, the madam kept her grip tight. And yet, compared to the men who ran taverns, guilds, or even city councils, the madam represented something rare, a woman in charge. Her authority was limited, yes, but within her world, she held command. She was a reminder that even in the darkest corners of medieval society, women found ways to carve out power, even if that power came from managing an institution that consumed other women's lives. The role of the madam exposes the brutal economy of brothels. They were businesses, first and foremost, designed to profit from desire. And like all businesses, they needed managers to keep them running. But while the madam might have risen above the women she managed, she was still chained to the same system of shame, hypocrisy, and exploitation that defined medieval prostitution. As we step deeper into this shadowy world, our next focus turns to the bodies themselves. What did it mean to work night after night, without rest, without protection, in an age when disease stalked every corner? In the next chapter, we'll confront the health and hygiene of medieval brothels and the devastating toll it took on the women inside. Health and hygiene. If the atmosphere inside a medieval brothel was oppressive, the toll it took on the body was far worse. Beneath the laughter, music, and flickering candlelight lay a hidden truth. These were places of sickness, pain, and constant risk. Hygiene was almost non-existent, medicine primitive, and disease a constant companion. For the women who worked there, survival often meant enduring suffering that could not be cured. Let's begin with the conditions of the brothels themselves. Cleanliness was not a priority. Straw covered the floors to soak up spilled ale, vomit, and worse, but it was rarely changed, quickly turning into a breeding ground for vermin. The air was heavy with smoke from cheap tallow candles, and the smell of sweat, urine, and rot clung to every surface. Beds, if they could be called that, were little more than straw pallets or thin mattresses, shared by dozens of customers over weeks without washing. In such an environment, disease spreads like wildfire. The most obvious danger was sexually transmitted infections. Though medieval people did not understand germs or viruses, they certainly recognized the symptoms: burning pain, sores, fevers, and wasting sickness. In the later Middle Ages, syphilis would sweep across Europe, devastating brothel communities. Even before that, gonorrhea and other venereal diseases were rampant, though often misdiagnosed as hot blood or corruption of the humours. Treatments ranged from the ineffective to the outright dangerous. Mercury ointments, bloodletting, herbal concoctions. Most only worsened the suffering, and disease was not limited to the sexual. Tuberculosis, typhus, dysentery, and other infections thrived in the crowded, unsanitary spaces. A single cough could spread sickness through an entire house. Bathhouse brothels, or stews, carried their own dangers. The warm, stagnant water used by dozens of men and women became a perfect breeding ground for skin infections, parasites, and contagions. What was advertised as cleansing often left women weaker, not stronger. Hygiene for the women themselves was nearly impossible. Soap was a luxury and baths rare. Prostitutes might wash quickly with cold water from a basin, but the demands of constant customers left little time for true care. Their bodies became tools of survival, used and reused until they broke down. In some cities, ordinances required brothel women to undergo medical examinations, ostensibly to prevent disease from spreading. But in reality, these were crude, humiliating inspections that offered little protection. Pregnancy was another constant risk. Contraception existed, but it was unreliable. Women used herbal mixtures, pessaries made from wool soaked in vinegar or oils, and other folk remedies. Some may have worked occasionally, but most failed. Abortions were attempted through dangerous herbs, like pennyroyal, or through brutal physical means, often ending in infection or death. For those who carried pregnancies to term, childbirth in the brothel was often hidden, the infants abandoned, or worse. The cycle of exploitation offered little room for motherhood. The toll was not just physical but emotional. Imagine a woman waking each morning on a straw pallet, her body aching, sores burning, exhaustion pressing into her bones. She forces herself upright, paints a smile, and steps once again into the smoky common room. She laughs, she sings, she entertains, but every touch reminds her of pain she cannot escape. Illness was a constant shadow, robbing her of dignity and years of life. Records show that many prostitutes died young. Few grew old within the trade. The combination of disease, violence, malnutrition, and exhaustion meant that the average life expectancy for a woman in a brothel was tragically short. Their bodies were consumed not only by customers, but by the very environment they lived in, and yet society blamed them for their suffering. Prostitutes were seen as unclean, bearers of disease, dangerous to respectable men. Rarely did anyone consider that it was the men bringing sickness into the brothels, spreading it from house to house, city to city. The stigma clung to women alone, branding them not as victims, but as sources of corruption. It is here that the medieval hypocrisy is most stark. Authorities licensed and taxed brothels, profiting from their existence, while simultaneously condemning the women inside as diseased and damned. The madam collected her coins, the city took its cut, and the women bore the cost in their bodies, their health, and their shortened lives. Health and hygiene in medieval brothels were not side issues. They were central to the brutal reality of the trade. Each candlelit room, each unwashed sheet, each untreated infection tells us that these were not places of pleasure, but of pain. They remind us that behind the laughter of drunken customers lay a world of silent suffering, endured night after night. In the next chapter, we'll peel back yet another layer of this world, the violence and abuse that haunted brothels. Because if disease was one constant companion, cruelty was the other. Violence and abuse, disease and exhaustion were not the only dangers haunting the women of medieval brothels. Violence both from within and without was a constant shadow. Behind the dim glow of candles and the raucous laughter of customers lay a world of bruises, broken bones, and broken spirits. Brothels were not sanctuaries of safety. They were arenas of vulnerability, where women had little power to protect themselves against the cruelty of men, the wrath of authorities, and sometimes even the fists of their own madams. The most obvious threat came from customers themselves. Men entered brothels, emboldened by drink, lust, and the knowledge that they faced little consequence for their actions. Violence could erupt at any moment. A soldier, fresh from the battlefield, might grow aggressive when a woman refused him, or if his pride was wounded. A drunken craftsman, with too much ale in his belly, might lash out when his money ran out. Even nobles, cloaked in wealth, often treated women as disposable, leaving behind scars physical and emotional that lingered long after they walked out the door. Women had little recourse when attacked. Complaints were rarely believed. Courts viewed prostitutes as unreliable witnesses, their testimonies discounted simply because of who they were. Even if a man was caught, punishments were minimal. The stigma of prostitution meant that society saw violence against these women not as a crime, but as the inevitable consequence of their sinful choices. In essence, they were blamed for the abuse inflicted upon them. Inside the brothel, the threat did not end. Madams and hired guards often used violence to enforce obedience. Women who resisted clients, tried to hide money, or dreamed of escape could be beaten or starved into submission. The madam's survival depended on profit, and any woman who jeopardized that flow of coin could expect harsh discipline. For many prostitutes, the walls of the brothel were not just barriers against the outside world, they were cages enforced by cruelty. Authorities, too, contributed to the cycle of abuse. Brothels were tolerated by law, but that tolerance was fragile. Periodically, during waves of religious fervor or moral panic, officials would raid brothels, dragging women into the streets. Public beatings, humiliation, and imprisonment followed. Some women were whipped before crowds, forced to wear marks of shame, or banished from the city altogether. The men who had visited them were rarely punished. Once again, the burden of violence fell squarely on the women. We must also consider the psychological violence that pervaded brothel life. Day after day, women endured forced intimacy, pretending to enjoy encounters that left them hollow. Every smile was an act, every laugh a mask. The strain of living under constant threat, of knowing each night could bring either coins or bruises, wore them down as surely as fists did. Some turned to alcohol themselves, numbing the fear with the same drink that fueled their clients' rage. Others fell into despair, their spirits broken long before their bodies gave way. And yet, amid this violence, there were small acts of resistance. Some women formed bonds with one another, offering protection when fights broke out. Others secretly stashed away coins, hoping to one day buy their freedom. A few even fought back. Records mention women who defended themselves with knives, or who attacked abusive customers in desperation. But such defiance was dangerous. Retaliation often brought harsher punishment, and survival demanded caution as much as courage. The cycle of violence in brothels reveals much about medieval society's values. These women were not protected by law, by family, or by community. They were treated as commodities, consumed, discarded, and blamed when broken. Violence was not an aberration. It was built into the very system that allowed brothels to exist. Picture the scene: a dim upstairs room. A woman flinches as a drunken man raises his hand. Downstairs, the madam counts coins, pretending not to hear the commotion. Outside, the city guard passes by, uninterested in what happens within those walls. For the woman inside, there is no escape, no justice, only another night of endurance. Brothels were marketed as places of pleasure, but for the women who worked there, they were places of pain. The laughter of men masked screams, the music of lutes drowned out sobs, and the flickering candles illuminated a stage where violence played out again and again. In the next chapter, we'll move from brutality to illusion. Because while violence and disease haunted brothels, there were also moments of performance, where women transformed themselves into entertainers, offering not just sex, but songs, dances, and the fragile illusion of joy. Entertainment and illusion. Step back into the smoky common room of a medieval brothel, and you'll see more than dice and drunken embraces. Brothels were not only places of sex, they were theatres, stages where women became actresses, singers, and dancers, crafting illusions of joy for men who paid to be entertained. The business was not only about bodies, but about performance, distraction, and the fragile art of making misery look like pleasure. From the moment a customer stepped inside, the performance began. Women leaned against doorways with coy smiles, laughter just loud enough to mask their exhaustion. They teased, flattered, and flung witty remarks across the room. Every gesture was calculated, a tilt of the head, a playful nudge, a whispered promise. This was the art of seduction, not born of desire, but of survival. Men weren't only buying physical intimacy, they were buying the illusion that someone wanted them, admired them, and found them irresistible. Music and song filled many brothels. A lute or fiddle in the corner, played by one of the women or a hired musician, created an atmosphere of festivity. The women often sang bawdy ballads, their voices rising above the noise of clinking tankards. These songs were ribald, mocking, filled with double meanings, encouraging men to laugh and loosen their purses. Laughter, after all, made it easier to part with coins. Dance was another part of the entertainment. Some brothels encouraged women to dance in the common rooms, twirling with scarves or clapping to the rhythm of a drum. These dances were often suggestive, designed to excite the crowd. In higher-end establishments, especially those disguised as bathhouses, performances could be elaborate, with women dressed in bright silks, their movements choreographed to stir desire. In poorer houses, the dancing was cruder, less artful, but it still served its purpose: to dazzle, to distract, to sell. Food and drink were also part of the show. Brothels doubled as taverns, pouring cheap ale and wine into the mouths of eager patrons. The more a man drank, the more he spent. Women encouraged drinking, sitting at tables with men, raising cups in mock celebration. They toasted victories, laughed at crude jokes, and listened with feigned interest as men boasted of battles, trades, or conquests. The illusion of companionship was as valuable as the act that followed upstairs. But behind this performance lay exhaustion. A woman might laugh at a joke she had heard 100 times, sing with a hoarse throat, or dance on legs that ached from standing all night. Her smile might hide bruises, her song might mask despair. The performance was not for her, it was for the man with coins in his hand, and like any stage, the lights went out when the money stopped flowing. Illusion also extended to the rooms upstairs. A woman might whisper words of affection, pretending to be a lover rather than a stranger. She might stroke a man's ego as much as his body, telling him he was strong, handsome, desirable. Many men craved this more than the act itself, the fantasy of being wanted, admired, powerful. For a few coins, they could escape the cold reality of their marriages, their poverty, or their insignificance. Brothels, in this sense, were mirrors. They reflected back to men the image they wished to see. A soldier could feel like a hero, a priest could forget his vows, a merchant could believe himself irresistible. The women inside knew this well, and they honed the illusion until it became second nature. But the cost of maintaining that mask was heavy. The longer a woman played the role, the more her own sense of self eroded. Still, entertainment offered moments of escape not only for the men, but sometimes for the women too. Singing together, joking, or sharing gossip between dances allowed brief flashes of camaraderie. In those moments, the illusion shifted. For an instant, they were not prostitutes, but performers, not outcasts, but women with voices and laughter of their own. Yet, when dawn came and the last customer stumbled out, the illusion dissolved. The songs faded, the smiles slipped, and the women returned to their straw beds, their bodies sore, their voices raw. Tomorrow, the performance will begin again. Entertainment and illusion kept the brothel alive. Without them, it was only a dark room of pain and transaction. With them, it became a stage one where women were both actresses and prisoners, weaving fantasies for men while hiding their own despair. In the next chapter, we turn from the stage of the brothel to the streets outside. Because while the women inside entertained, those who worked the alleys and roads faced a different reality: danger, poverty, and even harsher judgment. The streetwalkers, not every woman who sold her body in the Middle Ages worked within the walls of a brothel. Some operated in taverns, some in alleys, and many on the streets. These women, often called streetwalkers, occupied the lowest rung of prostitution. Their lives were marked not by flickering candlelight and music, but by cold cobblestones, danger, and relentless poverty. If life inside a brothel was harsh, life outside it was often brutal. Streetwalkers were usually women who could not or would not enter a regulated brothel. Some had been expelled for disobedience, others could not afford the entrance fees or bribes demanded by madams. Many were widows, abandoned wives, or destitute peasants who had drifted into the city with nothing but desperation in their pockets. For them, the streets became both a workplace and prison. Their appearance gave them away. Unlike brothel women, who sometimes wore bright scarves or stripes by law, streetwalkers often dressed in rags. Their hair was unkempt, their shoes worn through. Hunger showed on their faces. They haunted markets, taverns, and churchyards, waiting for men to approach. Some were forced to work in the shadows of city gates, offering themselves to travellers before they even entered the town. The dangers were constant. Streetwalkers lacked the minimal protection of brothel walls or guards. Customers could easily vanish into the night after beating or robbing them. Authorities harassed them regularly, dragging them off to jail, fining them, or publicly whipping them as punishment for disturbing the peace. Priests denounced them as agents of the devil. Even other prostitutes, those working in brothels, often looked down on them, seeing them as competition that lowered the trade's already fragile respectability. Their earnings were meagre. A night might bring only a few pennies, barely enough for bread or a corner to sleep in. Many had to choose between buying food and buying medicine when illness struck. Unlike brothel prostitutes, who sometimes had access to communal kitchens or beds, streetwalkers survived alone. Cold winters were especially cruel. Women waited in freezing streets for customers, their fingers numb, their breath white in the air. Exposure to the elements wore down their bodies quickly, and many died young. Streetwalkers also faced constant moral policing. Authorities viewed them as both sinful and disorderly, disrupting the public order. Cities like Paris, London, and Florence passed ordinances banning prostitutes from loitering near churches or markets. Those caught defying these rules were paraded through the streets, beaten, or branded. Still, the laws could not stop them. Poverty drove them back to the corners night after night. Yet even here, in the shadows, there was resilience. Streetwalkers formed loose networks, warning each other about violent clients or sharing scraps of bread. They developed secret signals to identify potential customers or to spot danger. Some aligned themselves with tavern keepers, who allowed them to solicit men in exchange for a cut of their earnings. These fragile alliances offered a thread of survival in an otherwise hostile world. Religious institutions occasionally tried to rescue streetwalkers by placing them in convent-like asylums. But such places were less about salvation and more about control. Women were confined, forced into prayer and labor, their freedom restricted as severely as in the brothels they had left behind. For many, the streets, dangerous as they were, offered more freedom than such sanctuaries. The life expectancy of a streetwalker was tragically short. Violence, exposure, disease, and poverty claimed them quickly. Chroniclers wrote of women found frozen in alleys, their bodies abandoned by clients who had used them moments before. Others vanished without record, their names lost to time. The brothels, with their regulated systems, at least left behind ledgers and ordinances. Streetwalkers lived and died in the margins, their stories scattered like whispers on the wind. And yet, despite all this, the streets never emptied of them. Every city had its shadows, and every shadow held a woman desperate enough to sell her body for survival. They were the forgotten faces of medieval prostitution, barely acknowledged by the law, except to be punished, barely remembered by history, except to be pitied. But they reveal the stark truth. Brothels may have been cruel, but life outside them could be even crueler. As we move into the next chapter, we'll shift from individuals to communities, because while brothels and streetwalkers shaped city streets, they also shaped how neighborhoods functioned, turning whole districts into red light zones that bore both economic benefits and deep social stigma. Brothels and the community. Brothels did not exist in isolation. They were woven into the very fabric of medieval cities, shaping streets, neighborhoods, and even local economies. While the women inside endured hardship and the men outside pursued pleasure, the surrounding communities felt the presence of these establishments in profound and complex ways. Brothels were both tolerated and condemned, feared and profited from, creating zones of moral contradiction that defined entire districts. City authorities often corralled brothels into designated neighborhoods, creating what we now think of as red light districts. In London, this was Southwark. In Paris, the Rue de Glatigny. In Florence, areas near the city gates. These zones were deliberately placed away from churches, schools, and markets frequented by the respectable population. The rationale was simple: confine sin to the edges of town so it could be controlled and taxed without corrupting the broader citizenry. Yet, these districts were not entirely hidden. Narrow streets became lined with taverns, inns, and brothels, their signs discreet yet unmistakable. They drew in travellers, sailors, soldiers, and merchants, all seeking temporary indulgence. The neighbourhood's economy revolved around vice. Bakeries sold food to drunken men, blacksmiths repaired the swords of soldiers, and tavern owners profited from both drink and the crowds that the brothels attracted. In this way, prostitution was a driver of commerce, even if it was morally condemned. Residents of these areas had a complicated relationship with the trade. Some families tolerated it because it brought money and business. Others resented the noise, the crowds, and the perceived corruption of public morals. Complaints about fights, drunkenness, and disease were common in council records. Yet city leaders rarely shut down these districts completely. The economic benefit was too great. Brothels were a paradoxical fixture, both necessary and loathed. Religious authorities, meanwhile, saw these communities as centers of sin. Priests preached against the streets, warning parishioners to avoid the temptation of brothels. Occasionally, church-led campaigns sought to purge districts of vice, staging raids, or attempting to convert women to more respectable trades. These efforts were often only partially successful. Prostitution had become too embedded in the city's economic and social structure to be eradicated. The women themselves were also part of the neighborhood dynamic. Brothel workers and streetwalkers often became well-known figures. Customers recognized them, children whispered their names, and local merchants adjusted their hours and routines around their presence. In some cases, women formed networks with local businesses, keeping watch over each other, sharing information, or gaining protection in exchange for money. This unofficial network created a fragile stability within otherwise chaotic streets. The presence of brothels also affected property values and urban development. Neighborhoods with concentrations of prostitution often had lower rents and higher turnover of residents. Yet paradoxically, they could also attract investment because of the steady flow of customers. Inns, taverns, and markets thrived alongside the houses of ill repute. Local officials were keenly aware of this. Closing brothels could starve the surrounding economy, while regulating them brought predictable revenue. Taxes, fines, and bribes became part of the fabric of city governance, embedding prostitution within civic life. Despite their economic role, brothel districts were stigmatized. Maps often marked them as areas of sin. Chroniclers referred to them with disgust, calling them dens of corruption and disease. Residents outside these zones feared the spread of vice, blaming brothels for everything from theft to plague. Yet within the boundaries, life went on. Children were born and raised, shops were opened, and communities adapted to the rhythms of these neighborhoods, however reluctantly. The interplay between brothels and the broader community highlights the contradictions of medieval life. Cities depended on vice for revenue and social control, yet condemned it morally. Women were simultaneously tolerated as laborers and shamed as sinners. Men could indulge freely while remaining respectable. Brothels were neither fully private nor entirely public. They were liminal spaces, bridging desire, commerce, and moral anxiety. Understanding brothels in the context of the community reveals how prostitution shaped urban life beyond the walls of the house. Entire neighborhoods bore the imprint of vice, with consequences for economics, social order, and public perception. They were engines of income and centers of tension, illuminating the complex interplay between morality, survival, and human desire. In the next chapter, we'll examine the legal system's role, exploring how city courts, police, and guilds regulated prostitution while balancing profit, control, and moral judgment. Law and prostitution. Medieval cities were a patchwork of rules, ordinances, and customs, and prostitution was no exception. Brothels and streetwalkers existed within a legal framework that was both contradictory and controlling, reflecting society's desire to profit from vice while publicly condemning it. For women in the trade, the law was both a lifeline and a weapon, a tool that could protect or punish at a moment's notice. Authorities did not outlaw prostitution outright. In fact, many cities recognized it as a necessary evil. Laws codified the existence of brothels, licensing them to collect taxes and keep vice contained. By regulating the trade, Officials believed they could reduce social disorder, prevent illicit violence, and generate revenue. Brothels were expected to operate within specific districts, adhere to clothing regulations, and maintain order among workers and clients. Licensing was central. A madam needed a formal license to operate legally. This often required a fee, proof of residence, and occasionally a good relationship with the local guild or municipal council. In return, the madam gained limited protection. The police or city watch could intervene if violent incidents occurred, and authorities tolerated the brothel's presence as long as taxes were paid and complaints minimized. However, this protection was fragile and conditional, dependent on constant compliance. City ordinances also dictated who could work in brothels and how. Women had to follow strict clothing codes, be of a certain age, and sometimes submit to medical inspections. These rules were intended to prevent disorder and disease, but were enforced in ways that reinforced control over women rather than their safety. Streetwalkers, who operated outside the regulated system, faced harsher treatment, being fined, jailed, or publicly humiliated for simply existing. Violence and theft were often adjudicated differently depending on the victim. If a customer harmed a woman inside a licensed brothel, the law might intervene, but penalties were generally lighter than for similar crimes committed against respectable women. If a streetwalker was assaulted, justice was often denied entirely. The courts treated prostitutes as part of the underclass, their lives less valuable than those of merchants, nobles, or clergy. Interestingly, law enforcement also focused on public perception. Authorities wanted to ensure brothels did not disrupt the broader city. Fights, noise, and visible sexual activity could trigger raids or fines. Madams were expected to maintain order, controlling their workers and patrons to prevent public scandal. In this sense, brothels were semi-autonomous. They could operate legally, but only by carefully policing behavior within their walls. City ordinances sometimes addressed pricing and contracts. Brothels could set fees, but in some towns, rates were standardized or capped. Clients could complain about overcharging, and madams could be fined for violations. This created a strange economy in which women's labor was both commodified and tightly controlled, while male desire went largely unchecked. Religious authorities added another layer of legal pressure. Clergy frequently pressured city councils to crack down on brothels, framing prostitution as a moral crisis. Occasionally, moral panic led to temporary closures, forced conversions, or public shaming campaigns. Women could be whipped, branded, or banished. Madams could lose licenses. Yet once the panic subsided, brothels reopened, reflecting the persistent demand for their services and the city's reliance on the revenue they generated. Guilds also intersected with prostitution laws. Certain trades restricted apprentices from engaging with prostitutes to maintain discipline. Blacksmiths, masons, and merchants were often fined if caught violating these rules. Guilds sought to control male behavior indirectly, while the women selling their bodies were subject to direct, pervasive regulation. The system reinforced gendered hypocrisy. Men were surveilled but rarely punished severely, while women bore the brunt of legal enforcement. Ultimately, the law treated prostitution as a tolerated vice, necessary, profitable, and dangerous. It sought to confine, control, and exploit the trade while maintaining the illusion of moral order. Women were simultaneously legal actors and condemned sinners, protected in theory but expendable in practice. The system ensured the survival of brothels while reinforcing social hierarchies and gendered double standards. As we move to the next chapter, we'll explore the dark economy of brothels, the money that flowed through them, the ways it was divided, and who truly profited from the labor of these women. Money and profit. Brothels were businesses, and like any business, they were organized around one central goal: profit. But in the medieval world, the flow of money in a brothel was far from straightforward. Every coin changed hands multiple times between the client, the woman, the madam, and the authorities reflecting the harsh realities of survival, control, and exploitation. Understanding this economy is essential to grasping the brutal logic of medieval prostitution. The starting point was the client. Men paid for services in coin, and the price often depended on social rank, the woman's experience, and the establishment's status. In high-end brothels, especially those in wealthier districts or disguised as bathhouses, nobles might pay a substantial fee for privacy, comfort, and the illusion of luxury. In poorer establishments or on the streets, a few pennies could buy basic services. Regardless of the price, the woman providing the service rarely kept the entire sum. Enter the madam. She was the business manager, and her cut of the earnings was non-negotiable. Depending on the arrangement, women might owe the madam a fixed percentage, often 1/3 or more, of each payment or pay for room, food, and clothing, in addition to this share. Some women, especially streetwalkers, tried to avoid such intermediaries, but without the protection and organization a madam provided, they faced far greater risks of theft, assault, or harassment by authorities. In essence, the madam's cut brought both profit and a form of security. City authorities also profited from prostitution. Taxes, licensing fees, and fines were levied against brothel keepers, and in some cases directly against women. Some cities even permitted local officers to collect bribes from prostitutes, ensuring compliance and extracting extra revenue. These payments created a network of oversight that enriched officials while maintaining control over vice. The madam, in turn, passed along these costs, ensuring the house remained legal, but also placing financial pressure squarely on the women. Interestingly, clients rarely faced financial consequences. They could indulge freely, often without shame, and were rarely taxed or fined. The system was heavily gendered. The women earned, gave up portions to keepers and officials, and risked punishment if rules were broken, while men could spend and walk away with no lasting repercussions. Profit flowed upward from the labor of women to the pockets of men in power, whether madams, guilds, or municipal officials. Debt was a pervasive feature of this economy. Women often borrowed from madams for food, clothing, or bribes, and their earnings were used to repay these loans. In many cases, debt ensured that a woman could never truly leave the trade. Her labor was bound to the establishment until obligations were cleared. Escape was possible, but costly and dangerous. Debts trapped women physically and economically, making them both profitable and expendable. Brothels also generated indirect profits for the surrounding community. Taverns, inns, blacksmiths, and merchants benefited from the traffic and spending that brothels attracted. Cities turned a blind eye or actively encouraged these districts because they bolstered local economies. The same moral authorities who railed against vice were often among those quietly cashing in on its benefits. Even within this system, some women attempted to improve their financial situation. Experienced prostitutes in high-end houses might earn more by cultivating loyal clients or by negotiating for better rates in exchange for particular services. Others tried to save secretly, hiding coins from madams or accumulating tips for an eventual escape. Yet these strategies were fraught with risk. Discovery could mean punishment, loss of earnings, or expulsion from the house. Ultimately, the money flowing through brothels tells a story of inequality. It demonstrates how medieval society commodified desire while controlling and punishing the women who fulfilled it. The clients walked away mostly unscathed. Madams gained a measure of authority. City authorities enriched themselves. But the women, whose labor made it all possible, carried the costs physical, emotional, and financial. Profit and exploitation were inseparable. In the next chapter, we'll examine the long-term consequences for women, exploring the stigma, social exclusion, and lifelong hardships faced by those who worked in brothels or on the streets. Stigma and social consequences. For the women who survived the brutal realities of medieval brothels and street prostitution, the end of their working lives brought little relief. Unlike the men who walked away from the brothel with their reputations intact, women carried the weight of shame, stigma, and exclusion long after their bodies could no longer serve the trade. The consequences were social, economic, and deeply personal, shaping the rest of their lives in ways few could escape. The most obvious consequence was public shame. Laws and social norms ensured that a woman's status as a prostitute remained visible, sometimes literally stitched into her clothing. Even if she left the trade, neighbors, employers, and potential husbands remembered the marks of her past. Gossip spread quickly in medieval towns, and women who had once been branded as fallen could find themselves ostracized for years. Reputation was everything in a society obsessed with female virtue, and prostitutes' reputations were irrevocably damaged. This stigma affected marriage prospects. A woman who had worked in a brothel was considered unfit for respectable marriage. Families rejected her as a potential bride, and men, particularly those of higher social rank, avoided her entirely. Even widowers or desperate men might hesitate, fearing social censure. In a society where marriage was often the only avenue to financial security and social stability, exclusion from marriage meant a lifetime of vulnerability. Economic survival was equally difficult. Many former prostitutes had few skills beyond the trade, and employers were reluctant to hire women with known sexual histories. Some turned to domestic labor, begging, or continued sex work on the streets, perpetuating the cycle of poverty and danger. Without savings, or if debts remained unpaid to a former madam, women could die in poverty, their survival dependent on charity or the uncertain goodwill of neighbors. Religious institutions contributed to this social marginalization. Convents and charitable houses sometimes accepted former prostitutes, but entry often meant strict supervision, labor, and spiritual discipline. Women were expected to repent endlessly for their past sins. While such institutions offered some protection, they also reinforced the narrative that these women were morally corrupt, requiring control and correction rather than acceptance. Redemption, in the medieval imagination, was never complete. It was a lifelong penance. Even physically, the consequences of prostitution were enduring. Disease, injuries from violent clients, and chronic exhaustion left many women debilitated by their 30s or 40s. Venereal diseases could cause infertility or chronic pain, while repeated abuse left scars both visible and hidden. These physical reminders reinforced social stigma, as women were marked not only by society, but by the very bodies they had been forced to use for survival. Psychologically, the effects were profound. Constant exploitation, humiliation, and violence could result in anxiety, depression, and trauma conditions that medieval society neither recognized nor treated. Women internalized the shame imposed upon them, and the isolation of their later years only deepened the scars. Survivors often lived quietly, on the margins of communities that tolerated but never fully accepted them. Streetwalkers fared even worse. Operating outside regulated brothels left them without the relative protections of madams or law, meaning that social stigma was compounded by vulnerability. They were more likely to be jailed, publicly humiliated, or beaten well into old age. Their names disappeared from records more quickly than brothel workers, leaving their stories lost to history, remembered only in whispers of scandal. Despite all this, women sometimes formed informal support networks. Former prostitutes shared advice, pooled resources, or offered shelter to those recently leaving the trade. These networks provided a fragile lifeline, a reminder that even in the harshest circumstances, women created solidarity and community among themselves. Still, these networks could not erase the broader social consequences imposed by law, church, and custom. The stigma and social consequences of prostitution reveal the profound hypocrisy of medieval society. Men could indulge freely, leave the brothel, and resume respected lives, while women were punished for survival, trapped in cycles of poverty, illness, and shame. Brothels thrived, not despite this inequality, but because it existed. The system depended on women being expendable, their labor profitable, and their social futures constrained. As we move to the next chapter, we will confront one of the most terrifying realities of this world: disease and mortality in brothels, exploring how plague, infections, and untreated illnesses claimed the lives of countless women who had no escape. Disease and mortality. For the women working in medieval brothels, death was never far away. Disease was a constant companion, stalking both the body and the neighborhood. Combined with the violence, exhaustion, and harsh living conditions they endured, the result was a mortality rate far higher than that of the general population. Brothels were not only workplaces, they were sites where life was fragile, fleeting, and often tragically cut short. The most notorious threat was sexually transmitted disease. Gonorrhea and syphilis, though poorly understood, ravaged the bodies of prostitutes and clients alike. Women bore the physical consequences: painful infections, sores, fevers, infertility, and, in many cases, death. Treatments were rudimentary at best. Mercury, a common cure, was toxic. Herbal remedies sometimes alleviated symptoms temporarily, but often worsened illness. Without modern medicine, infections lingered, causing chronic pain and weakening the body over time. Brothels were also incubators for contagious diseases like typhus, tuberculosis, and dysentery. Straw beds, shared bedding, and crowded conditions facilitated the rapid spread of illness. Parasites such as lice and fleas were common, carrying disease and exacerbating suffering. Even minor infections could become deadly, as a lack of hygiene and proper nutrition prevented recovery. For streetwalkers who lacked the minimal protections of brothel walls, the risk was even higher. Exposure to the elements, combined with insufficient food and shelter, accelerated decline. Plague struck the medieval world repeatedly, and brothels were particularly vulnerable. Their crowded spaces, poor sanitation, and high turnover of clients created ideal conditions for transmission. When plague swept through cities, prostitutes were among the first and hardest hit. Many died alone, abandoned, or in overcrowded infirmaries. Chroniclers often noted these deaths without much sympathy, reflecting society's view of women in the trade as both victims and sinners. Violence also contributed to mortality. A brutal encounter with a client could result in injuries that become infected. Beatings from madams, guards, or authorities could leave lasting damage. Miscarriages, complications from unsafe abortions, and injuries sustained during childbirth were common, particularly for women unable to access medical care. Each encounter, each day of work, carried a tangible risk of death. The economic system exacerbated these health risks. Women could not afford rest or proper nutrition. Their earnings were siphoned off by madams, taxes, and debts, leaving little for sustenance or treatment. If illness forced a woman to stop working temporarily, she risked losing her place in the household or, worse, being replaced entirely. Survival often demanded working through pain, infection, or exhaustion, increasing the likelihood that disease would become fatal. Streetwalkers fared even worse. Without the nominal protections of a brothel, they were exposed to violence, harsh weather, and starvation, making every infection potentially lethal. Records show women dying in alleyways, near marketplaces, or along city gates, abandoned by clients, ignored by authorities, and left to the mercy of neighbors. Life expectancy for streetwalkers was shockingly short. Many women did not survive past their 20s or early 30s. The psychological toll of disease and mortality was profound. Women witnessed friends and colleagues die regularly, sometimes in horrific circumstances, Fear, despair, and helplessness were constant companions, and grief had little room to manifest in a world that demanded continual performance and survival. This mental strain compounded physical suffering, leaving women emotionally and physically worn long before death claimed them. Yet even amid such mortality, some women displayed remarkable resilience. They formed bonds with fellow workers, shared remedies, and protected one another from the worst abuses. Small acts of care covering a sick friend with extra blankets, sharing herbal remedies, or lending coins for medicine provided fleeting relief in a perilous environment. Still, these gestures could not overcome the systemic forces that made disease and death inevitable. Ultimately, disease and mortality underscore the brutal realities of medieval prostitution. Brothels were not simply sites of pleasure or commerce. They were arenas of survival where life itself was precarious. Women bore the risks, endured the suffering, and paid with their health and longevity, while the men who used the services often walked away untouched. In this sense, the mortality of brothel workers is not merely a historical detail. It is central to understanding the human cost of a system built on exploitation and inequality. In the final chapter, we'll reflect on the legacy of medieval brothels, examining how these institutions shaped social attitudes, gender norms, and the perception of women in the centuries that followed. Legacy and reflection. Medieval brothels were more than physical spaces. They were institutions that left a lasting imprint on society, gender dynamics, and the perception of women for centuries to come. While the women inside endured disease, violence, and exploitation, the cultural and social legacy of these establishments extended far beyond their walls. To understand this legacy is to see how medieval attitudes towards sex, morality, and female labor continue to echo through history. Brothels reinforced a dual standard of morality that persisted long after the Middle Ages. Men were allowed to indulge, to seek pleasure freely, and to exit unscathed, their reputations largely intact. Women, by contrast, bore the burden of shame, stigma, and social exclusion. This division of moral responsibility cemented societal attitudes that judged women more harshly for sexuality than men. Even in modern discourse about sex work, echoes of this judgment remain, rooted in centuries-old assumptions about gender, desire, and power. Economically, brothels demonstrated the commodification of female bodies. Women's labor was extracted, taxed, and regulated for profit by madams, city officials, and merchants, with little regard for the women's well-being. The economic exploitation embedded in medieval prostitution set precedents for later forms of sex work, wage labor, and gendered economic inequality. The pattern was clear. Women provided labor, men enjoyed the benefits, and authority structures profited from regulation and control. Socially, brothels shaped urban development and community organization. Entire neighborhoods were defined by vice, with streets, markets, and taverns intertwined with the trade. This physical and cultural integration of prostitution into city life created zones of tolerance and vice, where commerce, sin, and survival intersected. The red light districts of medieval cities foreshadowed modern entertainment districts, demonstrating how communities have historically balanced morality, economics, and social order. The psychological and cultural legacy is equally significant. Brothel women's experiences of oppression, resilience, and survival became embedded in literature, chronicles, and folklore. They appear as cautionary tales, symbols of moral corruption, or occasionally as figures of cunning and resistance. These narratives shaped perceptions of women, sexuality, and labor, often romanticizing or vilifying them in ways that obscure the real suffering endured. For historians, these sources offer both insight and challenge, revealing societal attitudes while masking the lived realities of women themselves. The regulation of prostitution also influenced legal systems and public policy. Medieval ordinances, licensing, and policing created frameworks that would persist in Europe for centuries. Laws concerning morality, vice, and public order continued to reflect the tension between control and tolerance that characterized medieval brothels. The idea that sex work could be simultaneously tolerated, taxed, and condemned became a recurring motif in European governance, echoing the contradictions of medieval society. Perhaps most importantly, the legacy of brothels reveals women's agency within constraints. Despite exploitation, disease, and violence, women found ways to assert control, survive, and even profit. Madams wielded authority, performers mastered illusions, and networks of mutual aid allowed survival in an otherwise hostile environment. These acts of resilience demonstrate that even in oppressive systems, women exercised intelligence, strategy, and solidarity lessons that historians and modern audiences continue to study and admire. Yet reflection also forces us to confront the human cost. The mortality, abuse, and lifelong stigma endured by women were not incidental, they were central to the function of the system. Brothels thrived because women could be exploited with minimal societal consequence. The profits of the few were built on the suffering of the many, a stark reminder that historical pleasure often came at an enormous human price. Looking back, medieval brothels serve as a mirror to society, revealing not only the desires, hypocrisies, and economic priorities of the time, but also the enduring consequences for women. They illuminate how institutions, morality, and profit intersected, often in ways that left women vulnerable and marginalized. And they compel us to ask questions still relevant today. How do societies value or exploit women's labor? How do legal, economic, and social structures shape survival and morality? In examining this history, we honor the lives of those often erased from records. Their stories of endurance, pain, and resilience shed light on the hidden realities of medieval life. While brothels are remembered for the men who sought pleasure within them, it is the women who truly shaped this history. Their experiences offering lessons about inequality, survival, and the enduring human capacity for resilience. As we move to the final part of our journey, the outro, we will reflect on what the world of medieval brothels teaches us about human nature, society, and the power dynamics that continue to shape life, even today. Medieval brothels were more than houses of pleasure. They were spaces of survival, exploitation, and resilience. Women endured disease, violence, and lifelong stigma, while society profited from their labor and tolerated the trade. Their stories reveal the harsh realities of medieval life and the gendered double standards that persisted for centuries. By looking beyond the fantasy, we see courage, endurance, and the human cost of a system built on inequality. Thank you for joining this journey into the hidden world of medieval brothels, a world that shapes cities, communities, and the lives of women whose stories deserve to be remembered.